The rain beat down on the cracked pavement, a steady rhythm like an unrelenting metronome. The city was alive, but not in the way most people would think. It throbbed with a kind of malevolent energy, pulsing in dark alleyways and forgotten streets, a filthy underbelly that only certain people knew existed. Ryan was one of them. He ran through it now, his breath sharp and desperate, legs burning from exertion. The sound of his shoes slapping the ground was barely audible over the cacophony of the night, a distant siren, the occasional shout, and, worse yet, the whisper of something else in the shadows. They were close. Ryan glanced over his shoulder, his eyes wide with panic. In the distance, barely discernible through the sheets of rain, he saw them again. Shadows, moving unnaturally, sliding along walls and through the murky light of street lamps, like predators stalking their prey. They weren't human, at least not anymore. Whatever they were, they had been chasing him for hours, maybe longer. Time had become a blur since he first spotted them. He turned down an alley, the stench of garbage and rot clinging to the air. His mind was racing, trying to remember the way out. This part of the city was like a maze, twisting streets that led to nowhere, all of it forgotten and decaying. It was the perfect place for someone to get lost, or to be caught. Ryan knew he couldn't stop. Every time he thought he'd lost them, they'd appear again, closer than before, as if they were toying with him. His lungs screamed for air, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might explode. The sound of footsteps echoed behind him now, faint but unmistakable. A quick glance over his shoulder confirmed his worst fear. 3 figures, darker than the night itself, glided toward him. No faces, just shadows. How long had they been following him? Days? Weeks? Ryan didn't know why. All he knew was that he couldn't let them catch him. Something terrible would happen if they did. It was a primal fear, the kind that claws at your insides and screams for you to run, even when you know you can't keep going. The alley was a dead end. Ryan skidded to a stop, nearly losing his balance. A chain-link fence, rusted and covered in barbed wire, blocked his path. Desperation surged through him. He scrambled up the fence, the sharp metal tearing at his clothes and skin, but he didn't care. The figures were getting closer, their silent movements unnerving, their presence cold and suffocating. He threw himself over the top, crashing to the ground on the other side, and landed hard. Pain shot through his body, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He staggered to his feet and took off again, running down another street. The rain was relentless, pouring down in sheets and blurring his vision. The city seemed to twist and contort around him, each turn leading him deeper into its labyrinth of despair. He thought he saw a break ahead, a way out. The buildings were thinning. The edges of the city were near, and beyond that, the woods. If he could just make it there, maybe he could lose them. But the shadows were always there, just behind him, just out of sight. Ryan burst through the last line of decrepit buildings, his feet hitting dirt as he sprinted toward the woods. The trees loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, their branches like twisted fingers reaching out to him. He didn't care. He just needed to hide, to escape. The woods swallowed him whole. The sound of the city faded behind him, replaced by the eerie quiet of the forest. The only sound was the pounding of his feet on the wet earth and his own labored breathing. But he knew they were still coming. He could feel them, like a weight pressing down on him. The shadows didn't make noise, but they were there, moving through the trees, closing in on him. The forest was disorienting, and in the darkness every tree looked the same. Ryan was running blind, crashing through undergrowth, stumbling over roots and rocks. His clothes were soaked, his body battered and bruised, but he couldn't stop. There was no escape. He could feel it in his bones. But still, he ran. Then, suddenly, the woods seemed to open up into a clearing. Ryan stumbled into it, his chest heaving, sweat mixing with the rain that still poured down in heavy torrents. In the center of the clearing was an old crumbling house, abandoned, forgotten, like everything else in this forsaken place. With no other options, Ryan ran for the house. He slammed the door shut behind him, locking it as best he could. The house was dark and smelled of mold and decay. Every step he took made the floor creak beneath him, but it didn't matter. He was trapped now, cornered like an animal. He moved to the far side of the room and crouched low, trying to steady his breath. For a moment, everything was still. No footsteps, no shadows, just the sound of the rain tapping against the windows. But then he heard it, A soft scraping sound, like claws against the door. They were outside. Ryan backed into the corner, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to fight them. He didn't even know what they wanted. The door creaked open. The shadows slipped inside, silent as death, filling the room with a suffocating darkness. Ryan pressed himself against the wall, panic rising in his throat like bile. The figures stood there, just out of reach, watching him, waiting. And then, for the first time, one of them spoke. "Ryan," it said, its voice cold and devoid of emotion. "It's over." He froze, the terror so overwhelming that he could barely think. He recognized that voice. It was familiar, but wrong, twisted somehow. The figure stepped forward, its face still a blur of shadows, and Ryan's stomach twisted in horror as it slowly came into focus. It wasn't a shadow at all. It was a police officer. And behind him, more officers filled the room, their uniforms dark and wet from the rain, their eyes hard and unforgiving. Ryan felt the floor drop out from under him. He hadn't been running from monsters. He'd been running from them, from the police. The realization hit him like a sledgehammer, and the weight of it crushed him. He had killed someone. Not just someone. A police officer. It had been an accident, a moment of panic, but none of that mattered now. He had been running ever since, hiding in the corners of the city, trying to escape the inevitable. But you can't escape the law. You can't escape what you've done. Ryan sank to the floor, the energy drained from his body. The officers moved in, their hands grabbing him, pulling him up, their faces grim and determined. He didn't fight them. There was no point anymore. As they dragged him out of the house, into the clearing, the rain began to lighten, but the darkness around him felt heavier than ever. The woods seemed to close in, the weight of the world pressing down on him. There was no light at the end of this tunnel. No redemption, no hope. Ryan's eyes drifted up toward the sky, where the clouds parted just enough to reveal a sliver of moonlight. It wasn't enough. As the officers pushed him into the back of the squad car, the realization settled in, cold and final. There was no escape from the shadows. They were inside him now, wrapped around his soul like a noose. And as the car pulled away, leaving the woods behind, Ryan knew he would never be free again. The darkness won. It was a Halloween unlike any other. The sky was a dull, washed-out gray, the kind that seemed to suck the life out of everything below it. Not a ray of sunlight broke through the thick clouds that hung low and heavy, pressing down on the small town of Haverbrook. The air was unnaturally cold for October, a biting chill that crept into your bones and refused to leave, making the inhabitants of the town pull their coats tighter around their bodies. Even so, nothing could ward off the strange, oppressive feeling that had settled over the place. Leaves, once vibrant shades of orange, red, and gold, had turned brittle and brown, littering the streets and sidewalks in uneven heaps. They crackled underfoot like brittle bones, a sound that echoed through the otherwise silent streets. A thick fog had rolled in early that morning, smothering the town in an eerie veil of white. It clung to the ground and swirled around the gravestones in the cemetery at the edge of town, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. No one dared venture out unnecessarily, but the children, blissfully unaware of the foreboding atmosphere, prepared for their night of trick-or-treating. Pumpkins flickered on doorsteps, their faces twisted into devilish grins, as if they too sensed something amiss. By noon, the fog had thickened further, turning the world into a smothering haze. From her living room window, Sarah Fisher watched as the mist curled around the lampposts and trees outside. Something about today felt wrong. It wasn't just the weather or the gloom. It was the silence, the complete and unnatural stillness. "Mom, can we go out soon?" Her 8-year-old son, Danny, called from the kitchen. "Not yet," Sarah replied absently. She couldn't shake the sense that something was coming, something dark and terrible. Her heart pounded in her chest for no reason she could name. It was as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. By late afternoon, the first signs of real trouble began to surface. It started in the cemetery. Haverbrook Cemetery was old, older than the town itself. Some said it dated back to the early settlers, though no one could prove it. Tall, spindly trees lined the outskirts, their branches twisted and gnarled like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. The gravestones, weathered and crumbling, were half sunken into the earth, as though the dead beneath were slowly pulling them under. The caretaker, Mr. Gibbons, was the first to notice the disturbance. He had been tending to the graves as he always did, though today he worked slower, the chill in the air making his bones ache. As he knelt beside an ancient tombstone, wiping away the dirt and leaves, a low rumble shook the ground beneath him. He froze, his heart skipping a beat. The earth trembled again, harder this time, and he stumbled back, landing on the cold, damp ground. His eyes widened as he watched the soil shift in front of him, small pebbles rolling and clattering against the headstone. Then the ground began to break apart. Cracks appeared in the dirt, spreading out like the lines of a spider's web. A pale, gnarled hand pushed its way through the soil, followed by another. Mr. Gibbons screamed and scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He backed away as the hands clawed at the earth, pulling a decayed, half-rotten corpse from the grave. The thing's eyes, milky and hollow, fixed on him, and a guttural moan escaped from its cracked, blackened lips. Gibbons turned and ran, but as he fled, the ground behind him erupted. More hands burst through the earth, more bodies clawed their way to the surface. The dead were rising. By the time Sarah heard the first reports, it was already too late. People were screaming in the streets, abandoning their homes and cars as they fled in terror. The dead had risen from the cemetery and were shambling through the fog-covered town, their grotesque forms moving with an unnatural hunger. Sarah grabbed Danny and pulled him close, her heart pounding in her chest. "Mom, what's happening?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know," she whispered back, her voice shaking. "But we need to stay inside. Stay away from the windows, okay? Just stay close to me." The power flickered, casting long, dark shadows across the room. The fog outside pressed against the windows like a living thing, thick and unrelenting. In the distance, she could hear the distant wail of sirens and the faint cries of those unlucky enough to be caught outside. Sarah tried to calm her breathing, but the sense of dread was overwhelming. She knew this wasn't just some freak event or prank. This was something ancient, something evil. The fog swirled outside, and within it, shadows moved, slow, shuffling figures that didn't belong in this world anymore. Haverbrook descended into chaos as the dead moved through the town, unstoppable and relentless. They were not fast, but their numbers grew with every passing minute. For every person who fell, another corpse joined the ranks of the shambling horde. The streets were littered with overturned jack-o'-lanterns, their candles snuffed out, and candy spilled across the ground, forgotten in the panic. Houses stood dark and silent, the doors barred from within, but even that wasn't enough to keep the dead at bay. Windows shattered, and doors splintered as the undead forced their way inside, drawn by the scent of the living. As the fog thickened, swallowing the town whole, Sarah clutched Danny tightly. The house was dark, the power long gone, and the sounds of the dead outside grew louder with each passing moment. She could hear the groans and the sickening shuffle of their feet as they moved closer. The night stretched on, an endless nightmare. Sarah had lost all track of time. The sound of breaking glass jolted her from her thoughts. She stood, grabbing Danny's hand and backing away toward the kitchen. The front window had been shattered, and a decayed, skeletal hand reached through the broken glass, followed by another. Sarah's heart raced as she looked around for something, anything, to defend them with. But the realization hit her like a punch to the gut. There was no escaping this. There was nowhere to go, no way to outrun what was happening. The door to the kitchen creaked open, and Sarah screamed as she saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was Gibbons, or at least what had once been him. His eyes were clouded and lifeless, his skin gray and sagging. His mouth hung open, black drool dribbling down his chin. Danny whimpered and clung to her leg, and Sarah shoved him behind her, her hands shaking. "Stay back," she yelled, grabbing a kitchen knife from the counter. Gibbons took a slow, shuffling step forward, and then another, his body swaying unnaturally. She slashed the knife in front of her, but it was useless. He lunged at her, his cold, decayed hands grabbing at her shoulders. She stumbled back, falling to the ground as he pinned her beneath his weight, his dead eyes inches from hers. She screamed, struggling to push him off, but it was no use. His strength was monstrous, and as she felt his hands wrap around her throat, she knew this was the end. Danny's cries echoed in her ears, but they felt distant, like they were coming from somewhere far away. The last thing she saw before the world went black was the fog outside, thick and impenetrable, swallowing the town whole. By morning, Haverbrook was silent. The fog had finally begun to lift, revealing the broken remnants of the town beneath. The streets were empty, save for the dead, who now wandered aimlessly, their hunger unsated. Homes were broken and abandoned, the doors left wide open, but no one came out. The children's costumes, once bright and cheerful, were scattered and torn, forgotten in the dirt. The town of Haverbrook had fallen, swallowed by the dead, and no one was coming to save them. Father Matthew had served St. Bridget's for over 30 years. The small church sat at the heart of the town of Dunning, tucked between dense woods and rolling fields, its once proud stone walls now weathered and worn. The town itself was no better, a shadow of its former self, with empty shops, peeling paint, and homes that seemed to sag under the weight of time. The one thing that had never changed in Dunning was the silence. The town was too small for the noise of the city, and too old to carry the liveliness of youth. At dusk, the streets became deserted, as if an invisible curfew had been imposed. It was the kind of silence that seeped into your bones, lingering long after you'd left. In the confessional, though, silence was more than an absence of sound. It was law. No one knew when the rule had started, perhaps in Father Matthew's youth or in the time of his predecessor. But in St. Bridget's confessional, only the priest was permitted to speak. Confessors would enter, kneel behind the screen, and wait. Father Matthew would offer forgiveness, prayer, or advice, but he never heard the sins themselves. It had been this way for as long as he could remember. A strange tradition, but one that was followed without question. Then came the night when everything changed. It was late, much later than usual, when Father Matthew heard the door to the confessional creak open. He was exhausted, having just finished evening mass for the handful of elderly parishioners who still attended. The wooden bench beneath him groaned under his weight as he shifted uncomfortably in the cramped space. The church was nearly pitch black now, lit only by the flickering glow of a few dying candles. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," came a whisper from the other side of the screen. Father Matthew sat up straight. He had been about to begin his usual recitation, but the confessor had spoken first, breaking the rule. His heart gave a small, startled leap, but he forced himself to remain composed. "You are not to speak," Father Matthew said quietly, his voice as steady as he could manage. "It is tradition that I speak on your behalf. You need only listen." There was silence for a moment, a long, unnatural silence. Then the voice spoke again. "My sins are not the kind you can forgive, Father." There was something about the voice, a rasping, strained quality that made Father Matthew's skin prickle. It wasn't the voice of someone familiar, and in Dunning he knew nearly every soul by heart. He leaned forward, pressing his fingers to his temples as a cold unease crept through him. "You must remain silent," he repeated, but the words felt hollow. A breath, ragged and drawn out, filled the small space between them. "I've seen the truth," the voice whispered, the tone trembling with an eerie weight. "This town, it's not what it seems. There are things here, things that linger, things that don't let go." Father Matthew felt his heart skip. His hands clenched tightly around the edges of his cassock. The walls of the confessional seemed to close in on him, suffocating in their closeness. He had lived his entire life in Dunning, never once questioning its stillness. But something in the voice told him to listen, against all reason. "What truth?" Father Matthew asked, though his mouth felt dry. His breath came out in short, shallow puffs. He was breaking the rule himself now, but the old fear of silence had begun to gnaw at him. The voice on the other side let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh. "The dead don't leave Dunning, Father. They stay. They walk these streets. They sit in your pews. They pray alongside the living, unseen, unheard. But they're here." Father Matthew felt a chill crawl up his spine, coiling around his throat like a noose. His mind raced, grasping for logic, for reason. The voice, it had to be some troubled soul, some lost sinner speaking madness in the dead of night. That's what it was. Surely, that's all it was. But even as he tried to convince himself, something in the back of his mind stirred, a memory long buried. that he had never questioned until now. The faces in the church pews, week after week, so familiar yet so unchanging. The same people, the same places, as if they never aged, never left. "Who are you?" Father Matthew whispered, the words trembling on his lips. The voice responded with a bitter, quiet laugh, dripping with sorrow. "I used to sit in your church every Sunday, Father. You used to bless me, but I died 20 years ago." The blood drained from Father Matthew's face. The air in the confessional grew thick, suffocating. His heart thudded in his chest, each beat louder than the last. This was wrong. This was not the way things were supposed to be. "You're lying," he said, more to himself than to the confessor. "This is blasphemy." "Look outside," the voice said, softer now, the edge of desperation creeping in. "Look at the faces in your church. Really look." Father Matthew's hands trembled as he fumbled for the door to the confessional, stumbling out into the darkened church. His feet felt heavy, like he was moving through water. His breath came in ragged gasps. The pews stretched before him, shadowy figures seated in the rows, heads bowed in silent prayer. But the voice echoed in his mind, "They don't leave." He stepped into the aisle, his legs weak, and looked out over the congregation. His heart froze in his chest. They were the same faces that had sat in those pews for years, decades even. Faces that had never aged, never changed. An icy hand gripped his soul as he recognized them, names and faces from funeral services he himself had conducted. Old Mrs. O'Leary, who had passed away 15 years ago. John, the baker, who had died in his sleep a decade past. Young Emily, taken by a fever. All of them, sitting, praying, as if they had never died. Father Matthew stumbled backward, his breath hitching in his throat. His mind screamed for reason, but the truth pressed in around him like a suffocating fog. The dead had never left Dunning. They had been here all along, hidden in plain sight. And worse, he had blessed them, prayed with them, preached to them, never once seeing the truth. The voice from the confessional spoke once more, but now it came from all around him, whispering from the darkened corners of the church, from the pews, from the very walls themselves. "You've been keeping us here, Father. Your prayers, your sermons, they bind us. We cannot leave. We are trapped in this town waiting, always waiting." "No," Father Matthew gasped, stumbling back toward the altar. "I didn't know. I didn't." "Look at us," the voice demanded, rising to a deafening roar. The figures in the pews turned their heads in unison, their eyes hollow, empty, void of life. Their mouths opened, but no sound came out, only a deafening, suffocating silence. And then the voice spoke again, soft and cold. "You're one of us now, Father." Father Matthew's breath stopped as he felt the weight of the truth crash down on him. He looked down at his own hands, pale, thin, trembling. He had always been tired, always felt so weak, so worn down. How many years had it been? How long had he walked these halls, said these prayers? He had never left either. The last light of the candles flickered out, plunging the church into darkness. The next morning, the parishioners of Dunning came to St. Bridget's for Mass, as they always did. Father Matthew's seat behind the altar was empty, as it had been for years. But in the confessional, the door creaked open. A figure knelt behind the screen, waiting, as the silence stretched on. In Dunning, no one ever left, not even the priest. It had been years since Alden Hart first set foot in the dusty little bookstore on Greybrow Street. What began as a temporary job during his university days had turned into a career he never asked for. Hart's Books and Curiosities had been a fixture in town for decades, a crumbling monument to the lost art of reading. Alden had taken over after the original owner vanished without a trace, a mystery the townspeople shrugged off as if it were a common occurrence in their sleepy town. The shop had always been quiet, with the occasional patron drifting in to browse the musty shelves. But recently something had shifted. There was an odd chill in the air, one that clung to the skin and seeped into the bones, though the autumn days were mild. The bell over the door rang less and less, and then the deliveries began. Alden first noticed the strange packages one cold October morning. Plain brown boxes, unmarked save for his name and the shop's address. There was no return label, no indication of who had sent them. When he opened the first one, it was filled with books, blank books. No titles, no authors, no pages, just an expanse of smooth, creamy paper bound between leather covers. At first, Alden assumed it was a mistake from a supplier. Perhaps someone had sent him journals by accident. But as the days went by, the boxes continued to arrive, each filled with more of these empty tomes. He tried contacting the usual distributors, but no one claimed to know anything about the shipments. The phone line would go silent when he mentioned the blank books, a hollow, static hum on the other end. Out of curiosity, he placed a few on display, hoping to sell them as journals or sketchbooks. To his surprise, they sold quickly. Strangely quickly, considering the shop's usual slow traffic. It was as if the blank books were calling to people. One morning, a regular customer, Mrs. Winthrop, shuffled into the store. She was a widow in her late 60s. Known for her obsession with romance novels and her insatiable desire to fill her lonely hours with fantastical stories. She had seen the blank books a few days prior and had returned to purchase one. "How much for one of those?" she asked, pointing a gnarled finger at the display. Alden hesitated. Something about the books unnerved him, though he couldn't explain why. Still, he gave her a price, and Mrs. Winthrop left with one tucked under her arm. It was the last time Alden saw her. She didn't return for her weekly visit, and her house, once neatly kept, now sat dark and empty. The town murmured about her sudden disappearance, but no one seemed too concerned. People left town from time to time, especially the older folks. The strange thing, though, was that a week later, a new book appeared on the shelves, one Alden had never stocked. Its spine was rich red leather, embossed with gold leaf, the title, Love Everlasting. He pulled it from the shelf and flipped it open. Inside was the story of a lonely widow named Miriam, who finds love in the most unexpected of places, a young man who visits her in her dreams. The descriptions were vivid, so much so that they tugged at Alden's memory. The more he read, the more familiar it became. The characters, the events, even the woman's habits. It was Mrs. Winthrop. Alden dropped the book, his heart thudding in his chest. His hands trembled as he flipped to the last page. There, at the end, in a delicate script, was a note, Miriam Winthrop, bound forever in the pages of her story. The weeks that followed were a blur of confusion and fear. More customers came, drawn to the blank books as if by an unseen force. And one by one, they vanished. Alden's dread grew with each disappearance. He began to recognize the pattern. Someone would buy a blank book, disappear, and then a few days later, a new novel would appear on the shelves, telling their life story in eerie detail. It was as if the books were consuming them, transforming them into characters bound within their pages. He tried to stop selling them, but it was no use. Customers continued to ask for them, and somehow they always found their way into the hands of someone new. The boxes kept arriving, stacking up in the storeroom, each filled with more of the blank cursed books. Desperate, Alden searched for answers. He combed through the dusty archives in the back of the shop, trying to trace the origin of the deliveries. There was nothing. No records of any strange publisher, no invoices, no trail to follow. The town itself seemed indifferent, as though no one remembered the people who had vanished. It was as if the shop and its cursed books existed in a bubble, unnoticed by the world outside. One stormy evening, with rain hammering against the shop's windows and thunder rumbling in the distance, Alden sat at the counter, staring at the growing stack of books. He was exhausted, worn down by sleepless nights and gnawing paranoia. The air was thick with the scent of wet paper, and the shadows seemed to stretch and shift unnaturally. That's when the final package arrived. It was different this time, smaller, wrapped in faded parchment tied with a black ribbon. His name was scrawled across the top in a handwriting he didn't recognize but felt intimately familiar with. With trembling hands, Alden untied the ribbon and peeled back the paper. Inside was a single book. Its cover was deep black, with silver letters gleaming under the dim light, The Paper People. His heart raced. Alden opened the book to the first page, and his blood ran cold. There, in stark, simple prose, was his life. The shop, the deliveries, the customers who had vanished. Every detail, every moment he had lived, was written on the pages before him. He flipped further, There was no end to the story, just pages and pages chronicling his life in the bookstore, as though he were nothing more than a character in someone else's tale. Suddenly, the shop felt impossibly small, the walls closing in. The air was suffocating, thick with the weight of words unspoken. Alden stumbled back, his head spinning. The book fell open to the final pages, and there, written in the same delicate script he had seen in Mrs. Winthrop's novel, was a note: Alden Hart, bound forever in the pages of his story. Alden tried to flee. He grabbed his coat, his keys, anything that could help him escape the suffocating nightmare. But the moment he stepped outside, the world felt wrong. The street was empty, eerily so. No people, no cars, just a blanket of silence that pressed against his ears. The town he had known all his life seemed frozen, like a scene from an unfinished manuscript. In a panic, he ran down the street, past the darkened windows of closed shops, but no matter where he went, he always found himself back in front of Hart's books and curiosities. Each time the door was slightly ajar, as though waiting for him. With a sense of inevitable doom, Alden returned inside. The shop felt colder now, darker. The books on the shelves seemed to watch him, their spines gleaming in the dim light. He walked slowly to the counter, his hand brushing over the black book still lying open. His story. His gaze drifted toward the last page, the one that had yet to be written. Alden reached for a pen. He didn't know why, only that it felt as though he had no choice. His fingers closed around it, and he began to write. The next morning, a new book appeared on the shelf. Its cover was a deep black, with silver letters glinting in the early light. The Paper People. And inside, the final page had been filled, Alden Hart, bound forever in the pages of his story. The bookstore stands quiet now, its windows dark and lifeless. The boxes of blank books still arrive, and every so often, a curious customer wanders inside, drawn by the allure of something they can't quite explain, and one by one they disappear, just like Alden Hart. Thank you for joining me this evening. Before you go, make sure you subscribe and leave a like. If you have an idea for a short, scary story, leave it in the comments below. See you at the next campfire.